Hi, everyone. I'm Jane Sosland, and I want to welcome you on behalf of the Network for Responsible Public Policies program tonight, Democracy in the Balance. I'd like to introduce this evening's moderator, Roger Berkowitz. Roger is the founder and academic director of the Hannah Arendt Center for Politics and Humanities at Bard College. He is also a professor of political studies, philosophy, and human rights at Bard College. For those unfamiliar with the Hannah Arendt Center, it is an expansive home for bold and innovative humanities thinking about our political world inspired by the spirit of Hannah Arendt. Roger writes and speaks about justice. His writing has appeared in the New York Times, Book Forum, the Chronicle of Higher Education, and many others. Roger is the 2019 recipient of the Hannah Arendt Award for Political Thought. Finally, he recently led the center's annual fall conference on revitalizing democracy, which is available to view on their website if you missed it. Following our speakers' conversation, we will open the Q&A session, so please submit any questions you have. And I also want to invite everyone to NFRPP's next event on December 9th on Bridging America's Divisions. Thank you, Roger. Turning the program over to you.
Thanks very much, Jane. So welcome, everyone. I'm really thrilled to be invited here by the Network for Responsible Public Policy, a group I've worked with many times and have great respect for. I'm also really very happy to be introducing and talking a bit with Jacob Hacker. He's the Stanley Resor Professor for Political Science at Yale. Much more than that, I think he's one of the most innovative, influential, and thoughtful political scientists in the country who's done something that's very difficult, which is bring that political science into a publicly accessible format that has become influential and meaningful in our policy debates and our thinking about politics at this time. He's written many books. His latest book, which I think will be the background for his talk today, which he wrote with Paul Pierson, is Let Them Eat Tweets: How the Right Rules in an Age of Extreme Inequality. He's also won many awards, deservedly so. The American Academy of Arts and Sciences has made him a member. He's received the Robert Ball Award of the National Academy of Social Sciences, and he was inducted into the American Academy of Political and Social Science this year. Welcome, Jacob Hacker. Jacob, thrilled to have you here. Take it away and look forward to hearing your talk.
Thank you so much, Roger. I'm going to use some slides, so hold on a sec while I put those up. Let me just get a thumbs up from Roger to make sure that these are visible. Wonderful. So I'm so pleased to be here and to talk about this. I want to thank Roger and Jane, the National National what is it? National Fund for Responsible.
It's the Network for Responsible Social Policy.
This is a problem with acronyms.
That's
yes,
right.
I wrote it down, the acronym, but not the Network for Responsible Public Policy. And I should thank Stephen Summers and Rhoda Scherer, who helped put together this program. So as Roger said, I'm going to be drawing a little bit from my recent book with Paul Pierson, Let Them Eat Tweets. It's a book that's really not about, in fact, the first line of the book is that this is not a book about Donald Trump, even though it has tweets in the title. It's really about the long-term transformation of the Republican Party, and I'll say a little bit about that. And I want to just start with this sort of obligatory statement about partisanship, because I'm a political scientist, I study parties, and one of the things that I'm known for in my work on parties is this argument that the polarization of the two parties is asymmetric. That is, that over the last generation, the Republican Party has moved farther to the right than Democrats have moved to the left, though Democrats are definitely moving more to the left in recent years. And I actually don't, I think that's what the evidence shows, but doesn't really capture the really important argument I want to make, which is about the nature of the Republican Party, because what the Republican Party does is it combines a fairly conservative set of economic policy prescriptions, though one that's gotten more mixed in recent years, with a particular kind of organizational structure and approach to mobilizing voters. And I will say some stuff at the end about the character of the Democratic Party, but I want to really focus here on the Republican Party, because there is one respect, I think, in which, and let me just give you the basic argument. There's one respect in which the two parties differ in a pretty fundamental way that is relevant to what I want to argue. So my primary concern in this talk is really the health of American democracy. And I think it's pretty clear to anybody who's watched American politics lately that the American constitutional order does not do the greatest job dealing with hyperpolarized, nationalized parties. And I'll explain a little more why that is. But it's not just that the parties have moved apart, right? It's that the Republican Party in particular has moved toward a set of strategies that I think it's fair to say are anti-system. That is, they're based on an extremely strong emphasis on the corruption of politics, drain the swamp, on the sense that it's a war in which the other side is, if not illegitimate, at least suspect, and on a kind of crusade mentality with regard to gaining power that is particularly important, particularly rooted in the nature, I think, of its organizational base. And importantly, I think this would be much less of an issue if it wasn't also the case that characteristics of the Republican Party, the contemporary Republican Party, basically mean that it's advantaged in the current constitutional structure. I think we all know that the Senate is tilted toward the Republican Party because Republicans do better in less populated areas. We know that carries over to some extent to the House, especially with gerrymandering. I think what we're less attentive to is the way in which a constitutional structure that makes it very hard to pass major legislation tends to favor the Republican Party in ways that I'll talk about in a moment. And then finally, I think a lot of people during the Trump presidency talked about the threat that democracy would get undermined through a kind of authoritarian move. And that's obviously something to be very concerned about. I think the more constant threat, if you will, is what might be called minoritarianism. That is, if a party can entrench itself so that it doesn't have to be responsive to public opinion or the majority of the population, that's a real undermining of democracy as well. And so that's, I think, a backdrop for what I'm going to say is that there is clearly ways in which the anti-system orientation of the Republican Party can lead in turn to the capture of that party by an authoritarian-minded leader. And that's a greater threat on the Republican side than the Democratic side, I believe. But the minoritarianism is a strategy that's much more open to the Republican Party because of this third point about our institutional structures. So polarization. I remember when I was a kid, I watched a lot of Saturday morning cartoons. And I remember this public service ad coming up, right? You may recall it. This is your brain. This is your brain on drugs. Usually it was early in the morning. My parents weren't up, so I was always thinking, you know, could I get some bacon with that? But the reason I introduced this is because this is your political system on asymmetric polarization, right? This is the American constitutional order is really designed. It was designed not with parties in mind, and it was designed to both encourage and require kind of cross-cutting cleavages. It doesn't encourage them as much as it used to, but it still requires them. And often the result is great discontent with the system on both sides of the aisle, as well as kind of we've seen an escalating partisan war. And this is a very rare moment in our political history. With the exception of the period before the Civil War, we haven't seen this kind of intense, all the way down polarization that runs from the national level through the states and down to localities. And I think that it's that intensity of and depth of polarization coupled with our constitutional structure that really gives rise to the threats to democracy I want to talk about today. So the first point I want to make, and I've already made it, I want to make it very briefly, is that the Republican Party is has become a distinctive party structure and one that benefits from our counter-majoritarian institutions. In Let Them Eat Tweets, Paul Pierson and I draw on the historical work of Daniel Ziblatt. Now, Ziblatt is known well for his work on the erosion of democracy in the United States with Steve Levitsky. But this book, which preceded How Democracies Die, the book with Levitsky, is really about how conservative parties are really critical in the birth of democracy and its sustenance in its early period. And the basic argument is pretty simple. Conservative parties tend to be tied to traditional economic elites. When democracy is expanding and the suffrage is expanding to workers, they face a tension, a dilemma, right, about whether they should moderate on economics to appeal to these new voters, or refocus political conflict away from class issues, which are not their winning issue, and try to attract those voters through kind of what are sometimes called second dimension issues, like social issues or patriotism. And this can go well, and it can go very badly. The two cases that Ziblatt has are Germany and the UK, and you don't have to think very long to recognize which one went which way. Now, the Ziblatt argument is really about the rise of democracy, while our argument is about the rise of inequality. So we all know that there's been this stark rise in the share of income going to the richest Americans, and conversely a decline in the share going to the bottom half of Americans. The point we want to make is that when you have this kind of big social change, right, it actually is creating a similar kind of pressure for parties that you would have when you have new voters at the bottom of the income distribution moving into the electorate. Basically, over this period, the Republican Party was the party of business, and had historically attracted the support of top income, higher income voters. And they faced this question of, like, how do we adapt to a world in which many voters are losing out from rising inequality? And this is particularly acute for the Republican Party because over this period, we're also seeing a massive shift in American demography, and Republicans have traditionally been and have continued to be a party that draws on white voters. So they've really had to reach down the income distribution to attract more and more lower income voters. And interestingly, this has led to a shift of the class bases of the two parties, where actually lots of more affluent voters have moved towards the Democratic Party. But the point is that over the sort of 1990s and 2000s, the party was kind of trying to figure out what its strategy was for dealing with this shift in the electorate. And basically what its strategy was to move very substantially to the right. Now, this is just to give you a sense that compared with other conservative parties in rich democracies, the Republican Party is pretty conservative. Now, this is a look at party manifestos, and so it includes economic issues, but also social issues. And I want to emphasize that the Republican Party became much more conservative on social issues, in part because it wanted to remain pretty conservative on economic issues. So the sort of tradition, the typical kind of white working class Republican voter that we focused on so much in 2016 is pretty to the left of, certainly to the left of very rich conservative voters on economic issues, but it's to the right of those voters on social issues and on issues of race. And so for the Republican Party, moving to the second dimension with both a rational strategy and I think a kind of unstable strategy. And here's just a sense of that. So if you look here at the support for major pieces of legislation that were passed or considered in the last 25 years, you can see two things. One is that, well, the COVID relief bill in 2021 was really popular. So apparently polarization doesn't preclude politicians pursuing popular legislation. And you can see here that, among the most popular bills are pretty progressive economic bills, like expanding the minimum wage. Now, as you can see here too, the Affordable Care Act was not that popular, but in fact, the two least popular bills, two least popular pieces of economic legislation, one was passed and one wasn't in the last 25 years, were the two bills that Republicans tried to pass, and in the case of the tax reform, did pass in 2017. So the healthcare bill was extremely unpopular, and the tax reform bill was just slightly less so. And the tax reform bill, of course, did pass. The healthcare bill failed by just a few votes. I have a lot more polling data in the book, but the point is just that many of the economic policy parties Republicans have are not overwhelmingly popular. And so the party has basically formed a kind of what we call a kind of plutocratic populist coalition. And I put I'll explain this more in a moment, but so on the left, we have the sort of plutocratic side. On the right, we have the populist side and some of the major organized actors associated with each. But I put the right-wing populism in a kind of different color because I actually think it's sort of gradually taken over the party's main message. And you see that most notably with the kind of power of Trump to redefine where the party stands. So it may not have been a book about Donald Trump, but increasingly I do think that this kind of right-wing populist movement that Trump took advantage of has become a kind of the most powerful force within the contemporary Republican Party. And it has its organized forces. So if on the plutocratic side, you can think of business groups like the Chamber of Commerce or the Koch brothers, the Koch network of organizations like Americans for Prosperity or the American Legislative Exchange Council. On the plutocrat populist side, you can think of the Christian right, the somewhat weakened but still important National Rifle Association. And I think a really important side of this is right-wing media, which I think has played a really important role in kind of allowing and it's encouraging a kind of strategy of outrage stoking that has managed to keep the party in power, even though it's pursuing on economic policies stuff that isn't particularly popular. So I said there was a big advantage for the Republicans due to the countermajoritarian institutions of American government. And I want to be clear here, there may be arguments for many of these countermajoritarian institutions. That's not, my goal is not to make an argument about American what is more democratic in this context. We could have a debate, but but it is true that these institutions have become more partisan inflected and biased in favor of the Republican Party. And the most fundamental reason for this has to do with a paradox of density, right? The party that is in dense parts of the country in the United States faces a density, what I sometimes call a density tax, right? They're going to be disadvantaged because their voters are crammed together, so you can run up these outsized margins. And at the same time, you may not have as much impact on the overall distribution of seats in the Senate or the House. In the Senate, it's just the design of the Senate, 2 senators per state, regardless of size. In the House, it's a little more complex. It has to do with the fact that this clustering of Democratic voters particularly in urban and metro areas, basically makes it really hard for Democrats to do what Republicans have done, which is to basically create a lot of districts where they have solid but not overwhelming majorities. And of course, gerrymandering plays a role here as well. Importantly, like there's a kind of sort of reinforcing character to some of these counter-majoritarian institutions, because if you are advantaged, say, in the Senate, that also helps you with the Supreme Court. Kavanaugh, for example, Gorsuch and Barrett were all appointed with senators representing a minority of Americans. In the case of Kavanaugh, 44% of Americans. That is, they represented states that had 44% of the population. The Electoral College has a bias towards Republicans. It has much less to do than you might think with the fact that you get 2 senators plus the number of House districts for Electoral College votes. That helps Republicans. It's just basically kind of the vagaries of where the battleground states are that has helped Republicans. But this was a paper in the National Bureau of Economic Research where it showed that really, if we have close elections, the vast majority of cases where the Electoral College will go one way and the popular vote the other will benefit the Republican Party. And of course, that has happened twice in my lifetime. The other thing to say is that the Republicans have done better at the state house level, and And that's also been self-reinforcing. And part of that is that Republicans have pursued policies at the state level that I think quite clearly can be seen as eroding the democratic institutions, particularly free and fair elections. Jake Grumbach at the University of Washington constructed an index of democracy. It's a pretty uncontroversial list of things. And what he shows is that historically there really isn't much difference, but starting in around 2000, Republican states have moved in one direction towards less democratic institutions. And you can see that there's not really much of a countervailing move from Democrats, but that has led to a growing gap between the two. The most obvious manifestation of this is partisan gerrymandering. I think we focus far too much on the federal election reality of partisan gerrymandering and too little on what happens in state houses, because of course the state houses are not only passing important policies of their own, but they're kind of setting the rules of the game. So the reason you can pursue these policies is because Republicans have been able to build very formidable seat edges in many states due to gerrymandering. And but at the House level, they've been doing pretty well lately too, because they control these seats. So the last thing I want to talk about before I close is just sort of what do we do about this? So as I said, the sort of best version of this is that we'll see these really strong advantages for one party that can result in that party holding the presidency and the Senate despite not winning a majority of the popular vote. You might say, well, we have a Republican system of government with checks and balances, to which I totally agree. But it's worth noting that the way in which we think about these checks and balances is they're supposed to prevent, powerful majorities from running roughshod over minorities, not from powerful minorities running roughshod over majorities, which is unfortunately what we see when too often, I think, today. But it could, I think the other thing to say is that, this trend, if, weakening of democracy also can open up the door to a greater threat. So I'm far more concerned, for example, about the state level changes that are opening up the possibility of challenging presidential elections with partisan officials, the kind of challenge that failed because of actors who are willing to stand up against the efforts to overturn the 2020 election. And so I think it's really, that to me is, that is obviously one route through which minoritarianism could lead toward authoritarianism. So what are the grounds for optimism? And I think there are some. So one is, I do think there's more of a split between powerful plutocratic interests and the Republican Party. And that's been an important source of the Republican Party's financial strength, as well as driving its kind of recruitment and its agenda in many areas. However, I think the problem, if you will, with business, and I wrote a whole book on this, is that businesses are this is not their number one priority. And on economic policy issues, they continue to be the sort of aligned with the more conservative economic priorities of the party. And to the extent that those priorities are part of what drives the party to pursue sort of outrage strategies to attract voters, then they're not that helpful. Elon Musk with his phallic rocket, was recently mocking Bernie Sanders. Obviously, Elon Musk can have his own views on economic policies, but this isn't really a very encouraging sign for billionaires to be signing up to pursue reforms that would, democratic reforms that would be aligned with progressive Democrat stances. And, we have a lot of evidence in the book that actually the corporate elite are pretty conservative on average on economic issues and more aligned with the Republican Party. But here's just one. If you take the entire Fortune's 1500, 2/3, and define a Republican CEO as one that gives 2/3 of his money to the Republican Party, they're 3 times as common as Democratic CEOs, and they're twice as, and their companies are twice as big. I think there's a kind of important point to be made about democracy, which is that it is trending towards the Democratic Party. Particularly younger voters are much more aligned with the Democratic Party. And you know, that even Republicans like Lindsey Graham have recognized that. He didn't mention older because I do think its age is a really crucial part, but you know, these voter allegiances are not locked in stone. Republicans have actually picked up some support among Hispanics between 2016 and 20. But more important, I think, they've created these firewalls that mean that, you know, it could take a long time for these demographic shifts to really change create incentives for the party to moderate. And in that meantime, you know, John Maynard Keynes famously said, you know, in the long run, we're all dead. You know, in that time, our democracy could get seriously ill or even die. We're facing up, I think, to major, major reversals for Democrats. It's not surprising that, you know, not only is there there's been very effective gerrymandering in this round for Republicans, but more important, you know, the average midterm loss for the party holding the White House is like 34 seats, right? And Democrats only can lose 6. I just want to point out again what I said before, which is that for Democrats, their core thing is they want to pass a lot of legislation. They also want to do political reforms. And that requires control of Congress, right? And for Republicans, they can get a tax cut bill, you know, through every few years. The executive branch can do a lot of deregulatory stuff, but the executive branch can't spend. So spending is really a legislative function. So what we've seen lately is just how difficult it is for Democrats, even when they're in power, to sort of muster the kind of solid majorities necessary to get things done. And a lot of this has to do with cross pressures within the Democratic Party, but let's just remember the basic system is tilted against action. It's all the more so tilted when you have the filibuster layered on top of a system that's already had lots of checks and balances. And so I don't think that just passing popular policies is going to get Democrats a huge number of additional seats. But what happens is that even the popular policies get trimmed down to to virtually nothing as sorry, this thing keeps popping in front of my screen, trimmed down to virtually nothing as moderates, more moderate members use their pivotal power in a system that's really tilted towards inaction. So you can see this obviously in what happened to the infrastructure plan. It was bipartisan, but it was also tiny compared to what was originally intended. Even more so, you can see the sort of perversions of the system, and I think a particular perversion of the Democratic Party in what happened with what's happening with Buildback Better. Yes, they may get passed it through the House, but it's a pale shadow of what it was originally. Notably, the second largest item in it is this effort to try to undo a feature of the 2017 tax cuts that was unfavorable to blue areas, but really is a provision that primarily hit upper income voters, and so it's the sort of spectacle of Democrats using up a big chunk of their 1.5 trillion on tax cuts for affluent homeowners is a kind of a notable, I think, own goal, if you will, but reflective of the fact that the moderates have the so much leverage in this process. So I'm not going to surprise you, and I've written about this a lot, and Paul and I have written about this a lot, that doing some kind of democracy reform is obviously the only way you're going to really change a lot of these fundamental features. Now, I do think that we can do more to lessen inequality, and that will reduce some of the pressures on the system that I've described. But ultimately, it is the degree to which the system is tilted and makes it difficult to act, even when there's majority support for action, that is the problem. It's very hard to change the Constitution. We haven't really seen constitutional reform on a large scale since the 1920s, the 1910s and 20s. And right now, it's just a pretty simple question of math, right? For everything but the budget, you need 60 votes. You're not going to get Republican support. So the only way that you get only way that you get political reform is that if you get a Democrat in that 60th seat, which did happen briefly under Obama, but it seems very unlikely to happen for quite a while in contemporary American politics, or you get Democrats to agree to get rid of the filibuster, as Republicans did for Supreme Court justices. But obviously that has not been something that Manchin, the two moderate senators who've gotten the most attention, have been willing to support. Still, I think that's where the focus must be. And I guess my optimism to some extent stems from the fact that we now recognize that reforming our democracy is the most likely and the most plausible path to a stronger democracy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jacob. I'm sorry about that. Great, that was excellent. And let me just remind everyone that if you want to ask questions, try not to do it in the chat, but do it through the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Some of you have already started doing that. I saw Matt Polsky put some questions in the chat. Maybe just transfer them over to the Q&A so I can find them in one place. Let me begin with what you ended with, Jacob, if that's all right. And that is, you said that your optimism may come from your belief that we realize we need democracy reform, right? HR1, which you put up a picture of, was a sprawling bill, had a lot of things in it.
Yeah.
Everything from water bottles online to mail-in ballots to drop boxes. But one of the things it didn't have in it was much about, two or three of the main issues that I think you have highlighted, and I think rightly so. One is gerrymandering. Two is the state control of state transformation of nonpartisan election officials into partisan election officials. And so maybe we'll just start there. But is there any? I mean, Andrew Yang is going around starting a new party, asking us to focus in the midterm elections on two issues, or mainly one issue, gerrymandering, and what's it called, ranked choice voting. Is that is the Andrew Yang approach the approach you support? I mean, where's your optimism on voter reform, on democracy?
Yeah, and I think I probably should not have put up the HR1 thing. I was searching for some image of political reform. I think you're right. HR1 was really, really broad and therefore unlikely to make for kind of both a winning message and a winning policy strategy or reform strategy. That said, I mean, where Manchin and the leadership ended up on reform was not a bad start, right? So this would be, and it actually addresses to a significant extent both of your concerns. So the two things that seem to me most obvious. So there was going to be independent commissions in the Manchin vision, and that would be a huge change. I mean, one of the weird ironies, and it's not weird, it's actually kind of predictable, is that Democrats, when they have power, and they try to gerrymander. However, in a lot of cases, the states with Democrats have, because of good government reformers or because of partisan competition, have ended up with independent commissions. So they have, and then of course, as I said, for a variety of reasons, Republicans have done better at the state level, so they have more opportunities, right? And then you add on top of that the fact that the way in which the populations are clustered means that Democrats have a harder time gerrymandering, and you can see why gerrymandering has been very beneficial to the Republican Party. You read a lot of stuff that says so there independent commissions nationwide would seem to me a very good idea. The second issue, though,
is that something that the Congress can actually do?
Well, so I mean, a huge wild card in all this, you're right to ask this, Roger, is that when the Affordable Care Act was being debated, a lot of people were saying, well, there's nothing here that would raise the Supreme Court concerns. After all, you know, the Commerce Clause should justify requiring people to have health insurance. So I was against the individual mandate, I should say for the record, but not because I thought it was unconstitutional. And then, of course, the court declared that they could support the mandate through the taxing power. And meanwhile, they kind of came out of right field, if you will, on Medicaid, and nobody really expected that. Now we've had the court throw up its hands with regard to gerrymandering. We had the Shelby versus Holder case with the Voting Rights Act. The point is that the court could very well weigh in and say that a national requirement of independent commissions and or the second thing I was going to discuss, which was a national right to vote. So, which I think is which I think would be consistent with letting states do a lot of the administration, but with basically a set kind of national sort of automatic voter registration and very sort of important kind of ground rules for what states can do. But my point is only that you're right, Roger. It could well be that that policies that are being considered right now would run afoul of the court, which only drives home the nature of the challenge, right? Which is that this is a strongly self-reinforcing process. So I can say more, but I'll stop there.
Yeah, no, I mean, there is, I think it's Article 4, Section either 1 or 2 of the Constitution actually says that the states have the right to set the elections and time and place and who can vote, but the Congress has the right at times to overrule that. And so you'd think they'd be able to.
That's certainly what the courts historically have said. So the wild card is not based on past jurisprudence, but just on the fact that it's quite possible that the court might, or it is possible that the court would take a different view.
So can I just I just love to hear your thoughts. I don't know how, I'm assuming you've come across Andrew Yang's proposals on this, on gerrymandering and his forward party. What's your thought on his attempt to use this forward party as a way to oppose gerrymandering and seek democracy reform as its main goal? I mean, is that something you're interested in or not?
I mean, I'm interested in gerrymandering reform. I'm not sure I would build an entire political movement around this one thing. There are two things to say there. One is that, I was going to say a lot of people think gerrymandering is like creates polarization. That's its big effect. And that was what the New York Times recently had a piece, and it's like every other paragraph was like, this really creates a lot of polarization. But the Senate is just as polarized as the House, and obviously it's not gerrymandered. There is some movement of House members into the Senate, so that obviously explains it. But I think polarization is driven by group coalitions and voters and kind of nationalized processes. And I think the institutions, mostly their main thing is to give gerrymandering gives Republicans an edge for reasons I discussed, and also makes elections less competitive, which is a problem. I'm not putting aside my complicated feelings about Andrew Yang. I think there's a lot to be said for raising this as an issue. I will say, and it's something that I think is kind of taken for granted by people who live in the United States, but it's not true in a lot of countries, including countries that have single member districts like we do, like the UK, is that we have a really strong two-party system. Like Richard Hofstadter famously said that third parties in American politics were like bees, they stung and they died. But I often revise it by saying most of them are bees that don't have stingers because they don't even do anything, right? And so, this sort of perennial search for a third party solution in the absence of the kinds of institutional reforms that would make that possible, like ranked choice voting, always strikes me as sort of putting the cart before the horse. One of the questions was saying, you're a liberal and don't you think it's both parties putting party over, country? And so I'm not going to deny my basic views. I've written a lot of books and everyone can read them and judge for themselves my positions. But I actually think that for the reasons I articulated, I actually think that the way in which the Republican Party operates is different than the way, let's put it more simply, the way in which the structure and focus of the current Republican Party interacts with our constitutional structure is different. And the Jake Grumbach findings, as well as my own work with Paul, really shows that there is more threat currently posed by the Republican Party to basic democratic practices like free and fair elections than by the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party has many of its own foibles. So I'm not at all saying that there isn't truth to many critiques, but this is a very big difference, and it's a consequential one. And I also would say that part of the reason, as I argued, part of the reason for this, right, is that you have this self-reinforcing feedback, because there is this kind of fundamental feature of a well-functioning democracy, is that it should cause parties, it should encourage parties to at least moderate on certain issues, and also to sort of see themselves as engaged in a long-term contest in which if they lose an election, they lick their wounds and they come back, not they say that they lost, that they actually won the election and changed the rules, right? And I think the reason that you don't see that you see a kind of different response is because of the way this party has evolved. It's social, cultural, and economic, as well as embedded in institutional structure, American institutional structures. And if I'm willing to take a lot of heat for that position, but I think it's actually true. And I think that one of the ways in which we do a disservice to realistic discussions of national issues and the character of American democracy is if we always feel like we have to balance every statement about the parties. There are some things that there are some ways in which the parties are quite different, and this is one.
So it strikes me that there's you set up this dilemma that you take from Ziblatt and others, why a minority party can win, right? Why a group that's not popular can win. And one argument that you make is the one we've been talking about, which is that they basically corrupted the democratic process. Through gerrymandering, through
right. Or they've taken advantage of longstanding features of the process that now have a bias in their favor. To be clear, most of these things were not engineered by Republicans initially, but go on, yeah.
Oh, that's right. I mean, it's not illegal. It's the Electoral College. There were reasons that we gave advantages to rural voters, and there was a suspicion of urban and voters throughout the history of the United States. So
absolutely.
And so one answer is that, right? And yet you say at one point, the empirical evidence is out how much things like voting restrictions matter. And I think that's true. I mean, it's no doubt there's an intent amongst many on both sides, by the way, to take the rules and make them fit, take to their advantage, but it's unclear how much they matter. Gerrymandering may matter more, but that doesn't impact the Senate, as you said, that just impacts the House. So the other argument you have is that there's a kind of plutocratic elite, and that they have one interest, basically, which is lower taxes. Maybe I'm wrong, but that seems to be the main argument. And that they have figured out a way to manipulate the rest of the party. If you don't like that word, we can use the word mobilize around these other issues instead of war, like it traditionally would be. It's now these social issues in order to win. And so I guess my question is, you say that we don't have cross-cutting factions today, and yet those are some pretty big cross-cutting factions in the Republican Party. And even if you take all of them, that's probably only 35 to 40% of the electorate. You still need 10 to 15% of independents or Democrats or someone to join along. It does strike me that, one response that I have to this is, well, if the Democrats just could figure out how to appeal to the independents and to some of these Republicans on these other issues, we wouldn't have this problem, and we could, neutralize it to a large degree. Isn't part of the problem that to some degree there is anger and outrage against a kind of politics that was in power for many years and is culturally in power, that many people have, and that this is not just people being duped by plutocrats in the Republican Party, but people really do feel like the country has gone off track, and they want a different they want different people in charge. I mean, is there not an argument that this is actually what people want, or not?
Well, certainly there's a lot of evidence that there's not much support for core elements of the Republican economic agenda, right? We have a lot of evidence in that regard. But let me just go back. So our argument is not that the plutocrats have somehow duped voters. It's really straightforwardly focused on the party as an institution and how it has responded to the kind of as you said, the cross-cutting pressures it's facing. So coming back to the US being this like really two-party system, right? So one of the most important parts of a two-party system is that parties need to kind of construct winning bundles, right? And so our point isn't that all parties are constructed of bundles, but why this particular bundle? So why a bundle that includes not just tax cuts, deregulation, and a really strongly anti pro-fossil fuel stance, and with some of those things do over time become kind of popular among Republican voters, but it's pretty clear that the elites are kind of leading the charge on those. I think so. Where does the kind of power of the plutocrats to at least create the Republicans feeling that they have a choice to make, if you will, about where they're going to focus their energies with regard to voters? And I think it comes through a couple avenues. I mean, one is I think it's less important now than it was 15 years ago, but the way in which campaign finance is structured. I mean, of the donations in the 2018 election, 48% came from the top 0.1% of donors. So there's money, but I think.
But is that? I just have a question. Is that at this point top 1% primarily Republican, Democrat, or both, or even?
0.1%, just to be clear. Yeah, I mean, I'm sure that they are divided between the parties. As I said, what we know about the super rich is that they lean pretty heavily right. But my point is only that money has pulled the Democratic Party in certain ways too, right? So so the second point I would make is just the organized forces, the sort of organized forces of plutocracy, if you will, the Chamber of Commerce, the huge network that the Koch brothers and now the Charles Koch created, that spent more than the Republican Party as an institution in recent election cycles, was another important part of that, And so those are important allies. I mean, the Americans for Prosperity, for example, particularly at the state level, is often feeding a lot of people into political and public positions and so on. So there are strong reasons why the economic agenda of the Republican Party remained very closely tied to plutocrats. As I said, I think this is kind of breaking down, but we shouldn't look to the plutocrats for a rescue because their priorities are not that aligned with broader issues of democratic reform. And of course, if they lose their poll in the Republican Party, if anything, that's going to leave the party now to double down on more kind of extreme claims. So at this point in its development. So anyway, my point would be that this is really not a story about a kind of grand strategy, but rather a sort of evolving position of the parties. We have a line in the book where we say, the plutocrats aren't Bond villains in some kind of lair inside a volcano, plotting this outcome, but rather through their pressure on Republicans, the allied party, to produce highly conservative economic policies, they created this this dilemma for Republicans with regard to attracting more and more less affluent voters. And the point about there's a certain way in which saying, well, isn't this? I mean, there's huge discontent with the political system. That's clear. But to say that this agenda, the Republican agenda, or Republicans are popular because they win, well, and let's just be clear, right? Republicans have held the Senate for the last 20 years without once winning a majority of votes cast in any 6 year, 3 election cycle, right? So that's just a basic bias of the Senate. With regard to the House, again, it's not nearly as skewed, but it has been skewed, and then we have 2 cases in which Republicans have won the presidency without winning the popular vote.
Let me just,
yeah,
look at governorships, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which are not gerrymandered and not based in a countermajoritarian difference. And yet Republicans, I mean, look what just happened in Virginia and almost happened in New Jersey. I mean, we have to at some point, right? Don't the Democrats have to at some point say this is not just, gerrymandering and shenanigans? Somehow we've got to they got to figure out a way to speak to people who aren't voting for them or not. I mean,
no, I do. I think that's true. And it's not my my area of expertise, but there's clearly the case that the Democrats have suffered in a number of areas for lack of kind of clear messages. But I mean, again, I stand by this sort of basic view, which is that so first of all, I wouldn't put too much emphasis on midterm curse and backlash, right? This is a pretty recurrent feature of American politics. This sort of thermostatic swing. And I do think Democrats have done a terrible job because they're mostly fighting over their agenda. I think what I would emphasize is the extent to which, for a party whose primary reason for holding power is to kind of pass big programs that involve spending. It's a system that's very hard. It's very hard to look good in this system. And remember, Republicans' kind of core priorities, I said, tax cuts can be done intermittently. They obviously all, while Democrats can get some of their priorities through the budget process, Republicans can get their big priority always through the budget process, which is not subject to a filibuster. So I do think there's a way in which the playing field is tilted, and that can also make the Democratic Party look much less effective and divided. But my point is really not about the kind of the waves, if you will, of electoral back and forth, and more about the tide, right? So the tide has been in favor of the party. The Republicans, again, have not won a national popular vote majority since George W. Bush's re-election, and before that, his father. And yet they control, 6 of 3 seats in the Supreme Court. The state level story with governors, I actually think that's a potentially encouraging one, right? If you think about the Republicans that I look to as a kind of potential route out are those sort of blue state Republicans, which goes to show, I think, that, the Charlie Bakers of this world, that it goes to show, or Larry Hogan's, it goes to show that there is a very serious governing faction of the Republican Party. It's just not, it's having a very hard time operating in red states and at the national level. And that's mostly because I think, it is a party, I didn't really say this before, but I think it's fair to say that the party this is why I think the plutocrats are less and less psyched about the Republicans, is kind of a post-policy party in a lot of ways, right? Increasingly, the fights are really about where you stand rather than what government does.
That's the last question I wanted to ask
Sure.
you, and I'm wondering if there's a change in your thinking since you published the book till now, because in your book, you say that that in a sense McConnell and Ryan and the other plutocrats and other people, in a sense, played Trump, and that they got Trump to do the one thing they wanted, which is a tax cut. Not much else happened, and they actually stayed in control. But in today's presentation, you actually said that the right-wing populists have become the most powerful force in the Republican Party. Is that a change in your thinking since you published the book?
No, I don't think it's a change. I mean, I do think, so first of all, I do think it's not a change from what we wrote about Ryan. So I'll say a word, and sort of the establishment and Trump. I mean, I think unless we may have left a misimpression, but our basic view of what happened with the establishment is that Trump really had only a few things he was really interested in. Most notably, he was interested in loyalty toward him. And if, to use the Game of Thrones metaphor, if folks bent the knee, he was pretty happy to let them take care of the details. I mean, there are areas where he was much more aggressive, and he had strong policy preferences, but it's certainly not on a lot of the major items that Ryan was pushing for or McConnell was prioritizing. But I had a thought there, which is basically that that was in a lot of ways, right, it illustrates this point about the loss of control, because at the same time as many of these priorities, Republican establishment Republicans, as they're often called, were receiving many of these priorities. They're doing better than they kind of ever could have imagined, right? They were also, essentially accelerating this movement of the party towards the idea that it would be oriented around this kind of right-wing populist figure. And increasingly, it was the figure of Donald Trump that kind of embodied that. And so I couldn't have anticipated what happened in the 2020 election. I mean, COVID hit just after we finished the book, but and I think Trump probably would have been reelected absent the pandemic. But in a lot of ways, I think it is this sort of, in the book we talk about, what happens with these conservative parties is they're kind of tempted to open Pandora's box. And the thing about Pandora's box is once you open it, you don't get to control exactly what happens. And so, Fox has its own routines and goals. It was initially skeptical of Trump, but now it sees him as the best thing for its sort of long-term strategy of stoking outrage and maintaining a large viewership. So there's some good questions in the
yeah, we're going to go to the chat.
So let's go to them. But I guess what I would say is I have come to think that the plutocratic side of the Republican Party has really lost some of its hold. It's kind of a funny thing, because you think like it's kind of when it comes to many of these kind of conservative economic positions, it's kind of like a zombie party. It just keeps like lurching along. We're going to cut taxes, but it doesn't seem like there's like this driving passion behind it in the way that there once was. And maybe there is another economic agenda. You see a little bit of that emerging with like Josh Hawley and others, but for the most part, when you actually dig into it, there's not a lot of substance to their policy pronouncements. And I think the reason why the plutocrats haven't really been displaced on policy is partly because the party is not really that focused on policy in a lot of ways, right? Yeah, so that would be my take on it. Yeah.
Okay, great. So there's a bunch of questions. Couple have come up to the top, but just one that seems to go from what we were just talking about by Steve Rogan. Can you speculate on what it would take to move on from a Trump populist party to something else? And in your view, what would this look like, more extreme or less?
I keep hoping it would be less extreme, but it's a great question, Steve. So, in the book, I think we lay out a path for the party to reorient itself, and it would be essentially that the party became more multiracial, and in the process of becoming more multiracial was also less willing to use sort of divisive racialized issues. At the same time, if it were to become more multiracial, it would also have a broader sort of working coalition, working class coalition too. There's this old argument Du Bois made about the kind of the wages of whiteness. And it suggests, right, that for working class voters, right, if, white identity might be, it can be a very valuable a source of status. But to the extent you become a multiracial party, you may actually have to offer something. You might not be able to offer the wage of whiteness. You might have to offer wages, higher wages. And so that strikes me as the kind of happy story in which the party becomes more multiracial, in the same way that we've seen, we've seen parties moderate in American history, very extreme factions of parties moderate in American history, that we could see that happen. And that would be kind of the story of sort of gradual transformation of the party. There would be wide opinions. There would be a right-wing populist flank within the party, but it would not be dominating its stances. And you might see more push also for and more success for kind of more moderate Republican candidates at the presidential level. So that's the story we told in the book. And sort of the prerequisite for that was that the parties would have to really struggle electorally. And whether I agree, Roger, with your particular understanding of why the party hasn't suffered electorally, I agree that there haven't been enough pressure on it to really feel like it has to change course. Things seem to be working okay right now. And so I don't see any prospect for the party to take the message out of Virginia or what is likely to be a relatively successful midterm that it needs to moderate. Failing to capture the presidency in another presidential election might have some effect, but think about the post-2012 autopsy with Romney. It did not have that effect. So to me, absent kind of so I think you need two things, like absent a kind of some democracy reforms on the one hand, and some popular sort of political economic reforms that showed the way for because most of the time historically, right, when one party does something that's really popular like Social Security, the other party after a while just sort of embraces it, right? And that didn't happen with the Affordable Care Act, but maybe it could happen with maybe it could happen if with political reforms. What if the party said, we really like the expanded child tax credit. It's kind of a pro-family policy. It's some Mitt Romney want to do it through Social Security. We'd rather do it through the tax code. That's not that seems like a position the party could do, and it's it's hands off and whatever. So those are the kind of two things, and I don't see it right now, but that would be so if if Democrats are in a position again to pass political reform and they can actually get rid of the filibuster, or that they pass something popular that's strong enough and good enough that Republicans embrace it. I think that's the kind of cycle, the virtuous cycle, that would sort of reduce the temperature on some of these issues and bring the parties to some extent back together.
I think that's really interesting. And you started off by saying that the main way that it might reform itself is by diversifying itself.
Yeah, I think so.
I guess my first, I just want your thoughts on this. To what extent is that already happening? I mean, there's a lot of debate about whether Latinos are moving towards the Republican Party. I believe Trump won more of the African American vote than Republicans had in recent history in the last election.
Yeah.
To what extent is there? I mean, I assume your thought is they have to change their policies to take on a more diverse electorate, but it may actually not be necessary. Or is that wrong? I mean, I'm just wondering.
Look, I don't want to try to forecast American politics much more than that, given that I'm not an electoral specialist. I mean, these were changes at the margins. I mean, African Americans remain an overwhelmingly Democratic constituency. And what I understand of the Hispanic story is much more complex, as befits a really diverse demographic. But there too, I think it's fair to say that these were changes at the margins, and Republicans would like to build on them. It's hard for me to see. So there are a couple things that I think have been emphasized. One is that it was much more effective. Trump had a much more appeal among certain segments of these groups, men in these groups, and also there was a very effective kind of anti-socialist message that appealed to certain subsets of the Latino population. Maybe this can be built on. I do think it's pretty clear that the party has yet to sort of articulate an economic agenda that's that popular, and then the other thing to say is just that there are both these sort of demographic shifts, and then there's a kind of generational story, and the generational story is much less favorable for the Republicans. So the fundamental question about that, which is to say, younger voters are more diverse, but more important, they are much more Democratic within racial groups as well. And the challenge to think about there is this a generational? Is this a story that's going to carry through, or if it, as these voters age? And they're also not that high participation voters. So I guess I don't think that the Republican Party, as currently constituted, is particularly well positioned to make huge inroads among many of these Democratic-leaning groups. But I do think, given the firewalls that we've talked about, that may not be necessary for Republicans to hold power. And to the extent that it isn't necessary, then the incentives for Republicans to move in this multiracial direction may well be muted. That's my main concern. Like, I would be happy I guess I would like the party to be pro-democracy and multiracial. So I wouldn't be happy if they could,
Yeah, no, I get it.
If they could say the election was stolen and that would be attracting a lot more voters, which isn't true. I don't think it is. I don't think that's the key to what's happening right now. I think I have a lot of complex thoughts about the current electoral environment, but I think the fundamental thing that's going on is that that Biden is a lightning rod. The president is always a lightning rod. There are poor policy choices and effects in the case of Afghanistan, but a lot of it is just the huge difficulties of dealing with the pandemic and the economic effects of it. And so we will often come up with really plausible policy stories about what's going on at critical race theory might be really effective, or it's really about how badly many democratic states have handled schools or whatever. But I think these things are probably not as fundamental as the basic backlash story that occurred for Barack Obama and before him for Bill Clinton. And as I said, I think it's a story that we keep seeing with Democrats. It did happen to Trump, of course, but we keep seeing with Democrats in particular because of the nature of the coalition, right? The fact that they want to try to pass a lot of stuff in a system that is just not set up for that and tilted against the party.
Right. There's a question from Janine Hayek, which I'm sure you're going to love, is should we be worried about a civil war in our future?
Well, I'm reviewing a book by Barbara Walters. Probably is not Barbara Walters. That's I'd have to look it up. But she's a distinguished scholar of civil wars, writing about whether or not the United States could have one. I haven't read it yet, so I think you don't write a book like that unless you think it's a possibility. So I've tended to be very worried about our democracy, and yet not particularly worried about large-scale violent conflict. And even after the last few years, I feel like we could see continuing kind of sporadic violence. It's of the sort that we've seen, but not something where the country actually split into factions that were at war with each other. I mean, for one thing, we kind of forget that not only was the Civil War a conflict that was driven by as deep a polarizing issue as you could possibly imagine, but also that it occurred in a context in which the power of the federal government was relatively weak. Now, all the folks out there who are scared of a tyrannical federal government now are going to be like, I told you so. That professor is saying that they can do whatever they want. But I do think there's little prospect of the country fracturing into into armed fiefdoms in a context of a global superpower, military global superpower. And to me, the talk about civil war, it may distract from this more sort of ever-present reality, which is a system that just doesn't work very well, and which sort of brings out if Lincoln spoke about the better angels of our nature, I feel like the system is structured is kind of bringing out the worst angels or devils of our nature, maybe. And that, at least at present, is what concerns me the most. But Janine, I really hope that I'm right about that. And we should not be sanguine about violence. We've seen a lot of it already, and we could see more in the future. And it seems to me like we do need to redouble our efforts to identify extremist groups at home, because that's a real threat that we've kind of downplayed in our focus on extremist groups abroad.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's why the Republican reaction to January 6th is so disturbing to so many people, and that at some point, and Liz Cheney is, and a few other people are trying to do the right thing. I mean, do you have an argument about why so few of the establishment plutocratic Republicans have been able to, even on an issue like January 6th, stand up and say, this is too far? I mean, why can't they do that?
Well, I think that we should recognize that cowardice is probably as much a source of dark moments in our history as malevolence, right? So I think a lot of it is just it'd be hugely painful, right? You have to confront your own party. You're going to get attacked, maybe even threatened. you're going to lose your access to some of the major platforms for the party. You might even be kicked out. And there's a collective action problem there, of course, right? I think privately, a lot of Republicans probably do think that this was both a bigger deal than they say it is, and worse in terms of its character than they say it is. But that's a hard position. It's a hard position to take if you're one of the few people taking it. I was disappointed in particular with McCarthy on this. To me, he could have. I don't think it would have. I don't think that the party. Let's put it this way. I think it would hurt Trump to have January 6th be investigated in a more bipartisan manner. It's not clear to me it would hurt the Republican Party. It might actually have been good for it. Its standing to be seen as apart from that. And so in some ways, it all comes back to the fact that there's no figure like Trump within the Republican Party. And even though he's not an avowed candidate, it's pretty clear that he is now the person that the party is looking to for its signals, and some of its key members are afraid of alienating. Partly because I think if he doesn't run, there are several who would like to step in to be the standard bearer for the party and don't want to alienate Trump. And ambition is a very powerful drug in American politics. So, So to me, that's probably the fundamental reason. And it comes back to this point I made earlier about Trump was powerful in part because he was willing to kind of basically allow other parts of the party to set the agenda in a lot of areas, as long as everyone bent their knee. And once everyone's bent the knee, it empowered him in a way, and has sort of led to the self-reinforcing cycle that I'm talking about. One question we haven't talked about, which is like, how much is this driven by the intense Republican base? Is it that there is like a third of voters for whom Trump is kind of like is the Republican Party, and in a lot of ways, they're driving a lot of these dynamics, and I think there's a lot of truth to that, and there isn't really a story like that on the Democratic side. The progressives obviously have a lot of Twitter savvy, and there are supportive voters, but it's still the case that you don't have any kind of figure or faction within the Democratic Party that has a third of the electorate just loyally devoted to it. I mean, the Democrats, the most progressive wing of the Democratic Party is often the part of the party that is least willing to kind of act in a way loyal to certain figures within it. So it's a different kind of beast, I think.
Yeah, this brings up the question that Roberta Brown posed here, that many Americans fear the prospect of a more competent Trump-style leader, such as Ron DeSantis, winning the next presidential election. If someone like DeSantis becomes president, how likely is it that authoritarianism will supplant democracy in the US? Or do you think another more competent leader would be more dangerous or less dangerous to democracy? Country? Yeah.
I mean, certainly, there are very smart commentators who have made the argument that we, meaning people concerned about the threat of authoritarianism, were fortunate because Trump was, just not a very good authoritarian. I guess I have, I think given that he came closer than we would have thought possible to undermining many, to really eroding key democratic institutions. He eroded some, but to really undermining them. And so the more competent Trump, like a DeSantis, is he, more capable, gets better people in there who can deploy the arguments and sort of is more sustained attention. It's possible. I mean, to me, it's hard for me to think of a political figure who was more, who believed more strongly in his elevation, as his own personal power and elevation as the kind of core goal. And it's a kind of particular, I don't want to be characterological here, but it's a particular kind of, it's a skill, let's say, that Trump had. And, DeSantis is a very savvy politician. I don't know if he has that same orientation. I think, honestly, I think probably the threat is, I still believe that the most pressing threat is a kind of slower erosion and sort of establishment of institutions that kind of make it really hard to have a course correction and partisan reversal than it is to have a kind of big bang, either civil war or takeover, coup, I was very taken. I've been very taken with the scholarship of people who've looked at how democracies have eroded in the contemporary era, and the way it happens is a kind of gradually hollowing out and kind of replacement of institutions that once worked well to encourage contestation with ones that are really cementing the position of the incumbent elites. And that's what you've seen in a lot of regimes. And of course, they didn't have as strong of democratic traditions or institutions as we do, so it might be even slower here. But that's how I probably see it: sort of the normalization of things that were once considered to be really abnormal and undemocratic. That strikes me as the most likely outcome. And I do think Donald Trump is probably not the person who could bring about that kind of long-term transformation on his own. And so, but he did a very good job, I think, of surrounding himself with some able folks who are loyal. Look at the Supreme Court as an example. Like, that was extremely well done. Leonard Leo and the Federalist Society, Judicial Crisis Network, those folks, they know what they're doing. They've been working with the party for a long time, and they've identified a deep bench of conservative jurists. And so you can see that you could see a similar thing happen, blueprints for changing state laws around elections. So I feel like, unfortunately, it's going to be less obvious, but more insidious.
Yeah, no, I think your general argument about that, in many ways, minority rule is more dangerous on a long term than the threat of authoritarianism is quite provocative and convincing. There's a question that someone about the gerrymandering thing that I had said before, that isn't gerrymandering part of what state governments balance towards Republicans? So doesn't gerrymandering, in fact,
right.
I don't know what you think about that.
Well, so obviously, if the Senate had continued to be appointed by legislative leaders at the state level, as it was before the 17th Amendment, I think, then that would be true. So I do think that that one of the most important changes that we haven't really recognized is that it used to be that votes for senators were pretty uncoupled from votes for president and sort of party allegiances, and so that hardening of that divide has really increased the degree to which the Republican Party benefits from the density, or the Democrats lose from the density tax, right? Because the testers of this world, these are increasingly rare. These kind of small state Democrats have increasingly in more rural states. I put Rhode Island on another category. Maybe Vermont I know well, so that's another exception. But on balance, the vast portions of the country that are fairly sparsely populated have historically been places that where Democrats can actually contest by sort of adopting a different stance from the national party. And so nationalization of the parties, as I've said, is a really important change in the American system. And not all of that change is not all that change has been about the Republican Party. The degree to which we have seen like state level parties are increasingly sort of following a similar partisan blueprint at this in red states, and a similar partisan blueprint in blue states. But it's not just about that. It's also, I think, that that both parties have increasingly not had the kind of flexibility where Democrats can win in more conservative and more rural states, and Republicans can win in more populist and liberal states. As I said, governors are really the one big exception to this story. It's this exception that we should probably look at more carefully because to the extent there's going to be a cadre, a group of would-be presidential candidates and party leaders who are used to working across the aisle, it's going to be these mixed party governors, mostly blue Republicans who've governed in blue states, and who are a pretty different breed, obviously, than many of the Republicans in red states.
If you have a student who comes to you and say, "Where should I put my energies today?"
Right.
Is it in
it's
federal?
Like
is it for presidential elections? Is it for Senate elections? Is it for governor elections? Is it local elections? Do you go back and start trying to take over local town boards and county boards? Where do you think that the battle is going to be won in the next 20 years?
I think it's going to. So I really think it's going to be won in organization at the state level. So this is that Democrats are not going to be able to contest it. There's a basic reality here, which is that the system's not fair, but the only way you're going to change the system is if you gain power. And the only way that Democrats are going to gain power is they really organize in places where they're currently disfavored, and they're not going to necessarily win elections, but they're going to contest them. They're going to create more pressure for the other party to respond. And I do think that's a big problem with a lot of the things that happen at the state level, disproportionately in red states, but also in some blue states. It's basically a kind of solidification of the partisan balance. But I think that's where I would focus. I would focus on organizing the party that you favor in places where it's currently disfavored, because I think that's going to be most likely to have the biggest long-term effect. I also think, obviously, for folks who don't think politics is really distasteful and really dissatisfied with Washington, and I understand that sentiment, I think it's really important to recognize that popular power really does matter. We've seen that on a range of issues. We've seen that, like, ultimately, if you do see mass mobilization around reform, that you do see politicians responding. And I think that's partly Trump ran into that trouble. I think that's what happened with the Affordable Care Act. I also think, honestly, you see it on the other side when you saw the effectiveness of conservative counter-mobilization in 2009 and 10 against Democrats. And that's another kind of message that organized, popular, involved engagement is really powerful. So I would try to build state level party organizations, and to focus them on winning in that state, not to upholding whatever the national party agenda is. And then second, on joining up with groups that try to broaden popular participation in our democracy, because ultimately we need it.
So we're coming close to our ending time. There's a couple questions. I just maybe read 2 or 3 and let you answer whatever you want. John Collins asks, I haven't yet heard much about non-economic issues that drive electoral results. So, to what extent, I assume he's maybe meaning social issues, or maybe in Virginia, the education or critical race theory or things like that, or maybe even abortion. Matt Polsky writes, so do conservatives not love their country, at least as they see it? If they do, can that not be something to rebuild a democracy on? Otherwise, I'm not seeing much hope here if the goal is solving problems. I guess.
That's a hard one to say. I mean, I would never say that conservatives don't love their country. It's really something I dislike, is the kind of imputation of terrible motives to people on the other side whom you disagree with. I will say that I do think a kind of positive patriotism is probably a good ground for building that kind of engaged citizen participation. And I think I think part of the challenge that that Democrats have faced is the fact that there's a kind of bundle of cosmopolitan values that the party is associated with, not all of which are that popular. And I think this gets to the point about economic versus non-economic issues. I mean, my basic view on this is that elections are not. It's really hard for voters. It's a blunt. The vote is a very blunt instrument, right? And voters can say, stop doing that, or they can try to empower politicians whom they think will do what they want. But that our vision of democracy should not be that everyone has like a running tally of policy positions. I think rather they're kind of searching for people whom they think share their views and values. And more important, like they have the capacity to punish politicians who act in ways that are inconsistent with their views and values. So I think what's really troubling to me is the extent to which some of the trends we've talked about, and gerrymandering was the one that you brought up, involve essentially short-circuiting some of those corrective processes. And so it depends, even if you have a fairly thin view of democracy where it's really mostly about voting parties out of power, you got to have a system that's really open to that kind of responsiveness. And so we have the irony of a system that I think has got really close competition nationwide, but increasingly that close competition isn't mirrored in many of the places where people live and vote. And so that would be my view on this question of non-economic issues, is that I think for many people, the most fundamental questions when they come to the polls do involve like the question of their basic well-being, and economics is an important part of that. But what concerns me right now is that the kind of and we have this sort of very clear evidence of major public opinion disconnect on some issues where the party in power, the Republican Party, in the case of that I was talking about before, is pursuing policies that are really not popular. And what I worry a lot about is that sort of the basic mechanism that lead to sort of more responsiveness over time is not working very well.
Great. Well, Jacob, I want to thank you for incredible conversation and talk. Really a lot to think about. So thank you very much. And I'll turn it back over to Jane. Thank you.
Thank you, Roger.
Yes, thank you, Roger. And thank you, Jacob. That was a really enlightening conversation. I hope that our audience had their questions asked. There were lots of interesting questions, and this could continue. Lots to unpack. Wanted to also thank our audience for coming, and hopefully we'll see all of you on December 9th at our next event on Bridging America's Divisions.
Thank you all. It was a real pleasure. I appreciate the questions. Thank you, Roger. Thank you, Jane.
Jacob. All right.
Good night.
Good night, everyone. Thank you.